Hello, I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface. And Father, I want to continue off the conversation from last week when we were discussing the Pope as both the office and Pope Benedict, um, who has just passed away here on the 5th of January here. And asking a question about the office of the Pope, there are some, and I'm talking about things that have been written by the Pope. So not just like, hey, I'm at dinner and I'm talking about some stuff here, but things that have been written that come from the office of the Pope. Some of them are concrete, immediately implemented into Catholic life, and some of them seem more as just like, hey, if you guys get around to it, this is a suggestion. Maybe it's something to think about from time to time. And I bring this up, A, as a question of the core concept. It's intriguing to me, but also as a deeper question, or maybe a way to ask the question about the Vicar of Christ. Because essentially everything Jesus did, we try to implement in totality from the Gospels. Um, and the power that's instilled to the Pope has that absolute authority, but it's not in everything that's done. And that's, I guess, the nuance that I'm trying to ask about in this initial starting question to try to get a better grasp of all of this. Is it's something that's perplexing to me as a Catholic who's come up through Catholic school all the way until I was 22 when you count college. So, and I still don't understand any of this. So I wanted to use this moment to kind of ask some questions.
Well, so your point about doing everything that Jesus said in the gospel sounds really obvious, but really isn't. So, just to take one example, when Jesus at the Last Supper said, "Do this in memory of me," what was he talking about? To whom was he talking? And what did it mean? So, these things are not obvious. And yet, what I'm describing is at the very heart of our faith. We
Hmm.
understand that to be him speaking to the apostles, whom he has effectively ordained bishops in that moment, and has asked them to continue consecrating the Eucharist, which he has instituted at the Last Supper as a memorial of his presence and a representation of his death, the separation of his body and blood, which he then offers for us to have communion. So I just said a very dense couple of sentences, which the apostles could not have said in the way that I just said them. So that's the body of living interpretation of understanding, a body of teaching which has unfolded, has grown over time. How did that grow? Well, popes taught about that. Bishops taught about that. Councils uh, teased out the details of that and expressed that, found ways to express what the Eucharist is as the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, that it doesn't depend on the priest's holiness, whether it's really the Eucharist, that it is a representation of his sacrifice on Calvary in an unbloody fashion, what Christ did in a bloody fashion on the first Good Friday, that it is a meal, that it is, so all of these things are part of what the church's teaching office has unfolded over time. And that body of teaching develops generation after generation by taking in the teaching of the previous generation. And then there are certain questions that come up as an example for something in our time that has been very important is this kind of switch to the subjective. What does it feel like inside? These are the kinds of questions that we ask now. We live in a very psychological age and in a very experience-oriented age. And, we might root this back in 18th century philosophy and Descartes, and I think, therefore I am. We're very aware of the concrete reality of our internal um, identity, I suppose, and our internal experience as being a kind of factual reality. So, anyway, these kinds of experiential questions are important to us. And so then naturally we say, well, what did Jesus feel like inside? That's not a question that they were asking so much for the first 1800 years of the church.
Mhm.
They took him as a particular, I mean, he's human and he's divine, and they teased that out. And what he said is therefore God's word, and his humanity certainly plays a role. And they didn't try to tease out, a lot of the interior realities in the same way that we're interested in doing now. So how do we come to understand that? Well, we have to understand that in a way that does not contradict anything that has been taught in the past. Well, what things that have been taught in the past? By every bishop? Well, no, there's a certain kind of spinal column of essential teaching that has been developed in the past. And that comes through ecumenical councils, and it comes through certain papal writings, and also preaching. So Leo the Great, for example, gave a lot of homilies, and those homilies are doctrinal. We have them written down, but they were originally delivered by mouth. So it's not just writing in the sense that we would normally understand that today, but also the writing of things that were spoken. The chair of St. Peter is ultimately a preaching chair. And so we understand the Pope, the office of preaching as really being the way of communicating these truths. So, so all of that is to say, really what we're talking about is a massive body of teaching. And then that body of teaching kind of grows in different ways in different places. And as it grows, at some point, it has a way of being questioned. It's like, I don't know, there's a bishop that's maybe teaching more explicitly about, trying to express the humanity of Christ in a particular way, let's say. And he kind of pushes on some things and says, Jesus really wondered if he was God, because he's like human, and sometimes as humans, we don't really know who we are and what we're made for. And probably Jesus wondered whether he was God. When did he come to know that he was God? That's kind of an interesting question, and one can,
Mhm.
understand why that question would be asked. But so that's the kind of thing that floats out into the space of these sorts of teachings. And then then there's and I don't remember the details of how this went now, although I think it was under Pius the 12th maybe, and maybe from Humani Generis there were a number of specific points that he tackled there. But it's like, well, I understand why you would ask that question, but the fact is he was God. And although we don't know exactly how his interior functioned, where the God knowledge and the human knowledge and all of that intersected, his God knowledge, his divine knowledge was present. And God knows that he's God. I mean, what kind of God is he if he doesn't know that he's God, right?
Mhm.
So there's some dimensions of how much did Jesus know at what time about his mission, how things would unfold, and fuse knowledge divine. So the necessity to pull all of these things apart and apply them. But the Pope ultimately is the one who said, well, no, we can't say that Jesus didn't know he was God, because Jesus is God and God knows that he's God. So let's just nail that down. Now, how did the human experience and the human mind of Jesus develop? And how did the concepts form? And how did his infant understanding connect with his divine identity? And okay, we can keep playing with that, but let's not say he didn't know he was God, right? So this is a kind of papal development and clear teaching. Now, it probably wasn't the Pope that developed that. It probably was the prefect for the doctrine of the faith, Cardinal Ratzinger's role, to tie that back to our previous uh, episode, probably who sketched that out and who pulls out the proper magisterial teaching and who looks at the church's teaching tradition and this great body of knowledge and says, no, we can't say this. You can't say it this way. We need to find a different way to say it, a different way to explore this question. And then the Pope makes a definitive teaching about that particular point. But that's kind of how these things fit together. It's not the Pope just like coming up with his own ideas and then saying like, I think this, and now it's going to be doctrine.
Mhm.
um, that's not how all of that develops. So it's always in the context of the universal magisterium. I remember early on, Pope Francis made a statement that gave a little sense of this. He was speaking a bit extemporaneously. I forget what the occasion was, but he said, He said, the poor, talking about the poor people, poverty, people who live in poverty. He says the poor is not just a social category; it's a theological category. And then he said, "Can I say that?" So it's a great moment. And then he came back around a little bit later and doubled down on it, and actually taught it in his exhortation, "The Joy of the Gospel," and said, the poor is a theological category because touching the flesh of the poor is touching the flesh of Christ. Because Matthew 25, Jesus says, whatever you did for one of these least of my brothers, you did it to me. And so we can make a kind of identification that the poor are an expression, they're a kind of sacramental, they bring God to us in a particular way. So again, all of that is a sense of how this doctrine develops. And then when Pope Francis actually publishes something, and especially at the level of an encyclical, so an encyclical carries the highest weight, and the things that are written in encyclical letters of Pope Francis, but to another degree, his homilies and his apostolic exhortations, even apostolic letters, some of these different categories of teaching that he designates, his Wednesday audiences, they all have teaching authority. Now, again, many of the things that he says are not matters of doctrine so much. I mean, he's hypothesizing about something, he's reflecting on something, he's making a pastoral application of something. It's not, he's not trying to teach doctrine in those places, and so we don't take it as doctrine either.
And that's probably, I guess, the important thing to tease out the difference of here. Whenever he says, in the middle of the square, I want to have a 30-foot Christmas tree, that does not mean every parish needs to have a 30-foot Christmas tree. So when I remember whenever, and I hope I don't misquote this because this is 5-ish years ago, when Pope Francis had become it was early in his papacy, he wrote something to the effect that the way that he viewed capitalism was that capitalism was bad. I don't have all the ins and outs of it, but if I'm understanding you correctly, that was not because it's not about the doctrine, it's not an official stance. Basically saying participating in capitalism does not make you anti-Catholic or Christian. It just was his view upon it, from what he had known of growing up in Central America, was not good, which, for the record, it's not the same kind of capitalism that you experience here in America. They are very different, almost to the point where they should use different words. But neither here nor there. My point of what I'm trying to say there is that falls in the same category of, we want to have a 30-foot Christmas tree. It's not something that says, hey, you have to do this to follow the faith. Is that the correct assumption here?
Well, and not to press into your example too much, but it actually helps to illustrate the point. So just for the sake of doing that. So Pope Francis never said capitalism is bad, and he wouldn't say that because bad is a moral category, and for the Pope to make a moral declaration is also an element of his teaching office. And if he made that moral declaration, we would need to pay attention to that. So he didn't say that, and he wouldn't say that. He did make nuanced declarations, and I don't know them as well as I know John Paul II's nuanced declarations. Pope John Paul II said that unbridled capitalism is intrinsically wrong. So John Paul II said that. Unbridled capitalism. So that is to say, capitalism without any kind of controls that do things like prevent monopolies. So we in the United States don't have unbridled capitalism. We have a government that inserts certain correctives at different times in order to shape the space of capitalism, to create a free market, but not totally free. Free within certain limits that protect the needs of the poor, that protect the disadvantaged, that protect competition, that allow capitalism always to have a place to foster. And so that's the kind of thing that, a pope would say, that there are certain. So likewise with communism, there are a couple of points of communism which are kind of intrinsic to communism that make it wrong, immoral, and the not having private property is a key problem of communism. So any government that prevents the ownership of private property is going to have that problem, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter if you call it capitalism, but you prevent having private property, it's going to be a problem. So it separates also the what's wrong with the names. The names ultimately don't matter, only insofar as they're actually capturing particular qualities of a governmental system. So anyway, Pope Francis taught around, and he used more like provocative terms also. He said, the problem with the economy today is that instead of the human person being the center of the economy, so in other words, the economy serving the human person, money is the center of the economy, and we have the human person serving money. And he said that's a distortion, that's problematic. And that's universally problematic. Whenever the human person is serving money, then there's something that's fundamentally wrong happening. Money always needs to be serving the person. Now, you could argue, well, it's not really the case here. and so that's where we wrestle with, ideas and how they're applied and things like that. But the Pope's teaching office, and he would, if he were really trying to make a clear teaching on this, he would draw from many of the social encyclicals that his predecessors had published, which use very precise language and are trying to express the gospel in today's terms with governments and economies and monies and currency and stock exchanges and all kinds of other things that didn't exist 2,000 years ago. How do we apply the teachings of the gospel in these spaces? Well, that's not obvious, but that's where the teaching body of the church is really helpful. And when the Pope teaches something in a definitive way like that, even still, it could be amended by subsequent popes might nuance or correct or add to or make adjustments around some of those things. And so we have some of that space, and then there's some a smaller set of teachings which are irreformable. But those tend to be things like, like abortion, for one thing. John Paul II really declared that as an irreformable teaching. Killing the innocent human life in the womb is never okay under any circumstances and never will be, period. Right? So, but also things like the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption of Mary, that these are irreformable teachings. We believe these, period. And so those are some stronger papal statements.
Yeah, so that actually opens another set of questions. So that makes sense. This to summarize it down to one thing, some things that are obvious in the moral teachings, those can be absolute. Murder, bad, therefore abortion is bad. It's pretty straightforward like that. But in the last episode, you mentioned how the Pope has to honor the previous teachings of the Pope. And you kind of gave an example there of how it actually works. But we also live in an era where there is, no matter what era, new things going on that the church has not experienced before. That's the evolution of life in all kinds of different fields. You can see that. On the one hand, the faith is living has to be here in today, the eternal present, with these new things, and essentially have answers upon them. Back in the day, probably still going on, cloning was not physically possible. It was just an idea, maybe in some sci-fi books, but then it actually happened. And then the church has to give an answer on that. I mean, relative, and this time window of thinking about it gets shorter and shorter the more and more our culture gets driven by we need immediate information. Inherently, what I have seen many times throughout human beings, the more we are forced to give immediate answers, the more likely those answers tend to be wrong. So my question is that in the now, where we need to give answers immediately, how does the church recognize the problem that maybe one of these immediate answers isn't perfect, but we just know it's not going to be 100% wrong? I mean, what I'm trying to get with is everyone needs an answer now. It's not easy to give complicated answers immediately, especially for something that didn't exist 20 minutes ago. And this problem isn't going away. I mean, it's cloning in the 1990s. It'll be something different in 2030, and it'll be something different in 2035. Like, it's just coming more and more faster. So what is the vehicle of the papacy to say, oh, I can revisit an idea that I might be wrong on, and also having enough knowledge to hit the correct answer more often than not up front?
So some things do have immediate answers. Currently, cloning is not possible without the destruction of human embryos, and so it's morally wrong. Period. So we can't do cloning the way that it's done because it involves the destruction of human beings in the embryonic stage of development. So some things do allow for immediate responses because they involve other things that are already clear and intrinsically wrong. Other things like embryo adoption, for example, we have these frozen fertilized eggs. Is it possible to implant them in a woman's womb for her to adopt a frozen embryo? Is that possible? Is that morally licit? So that's been an open question for 25 years. And there's been some development of teaching, some argumentation. There are moral theologians who have sent positions to Rome. Rome has clarified bits and pieces of that, but there actually hasn't been a definitive teaching on that question. Another example was for a person in what's called a persistent vegetative state. So the Terry Schiavo case was the most kind of clear and horrific example of someone who could have lived with nutrition and hydration. So all she was receiving was liquid food, basically in an IV, and she could exist indefinitely. And she had, some whatever. It's not clear. Some people in that state have woken up after like 17 years. I mean, you just can't guarantee that person is dead. And if they're alive, then you have to give them what is basic nutrition. And so, but that was also a question. In fact, the Texas bishops had just published a statement that it wasn't necessary to provide nutrition and hydration to people in a persistent vegetative state. And then Pope John Paul made a declaration that it was and overrode that. I don't know that he was addressing them particularly, but just how the timing happened to be there. And so then we have to incorporate that teaching, that understanding. So but there are lots of theologians, and the Vatican discerns certain topics. The Vatican doesn't teach prematurely so that the teaching will be accurate. And so artificial birth control was another example. That was a new kind of birth control. So the barrier method, the withdrawal method, these things were clearly wrong. They were violating the meaning of the sexual act. But now we had these pills which didn't provide an obvious barrier, which didn't interrupt the act. What about this? How do we understand this? And so they put together a commission of theologians, of experts of different kinds to, investigate the idea. And then Pope Paul VI gave a definitive teaching on that particular question. And so anyway, there is not, things aren't done immediately when they don't have to be, and not everything has to be done immediately. And until the Rome has taught definitively on it, so like the question of embryo adoption, my opinion matters. So if somebody comes to me and asks me if it's okay, I would say to them, well, the church hasn't taught on it. Here's my opinion. And then you need to take in what you can, and then you may need to make a decision according to your conscience. You need to take it up with God because there isn't a clear teaching. Here are the principles. Here's what matters. Here's what I think. And then you got to choose, and you got to do the best you can.
Yeah, and one last one here, and if this has the potential of going skyrocket and being a very long answer, I apologize. But in what you were teaching there about things being clearly right and wrong, um, having talked to you a long time, so I have a lot of different thoughts that have popped into my head. Um, this one's one is about the notion of people saying I'm just ready to die. I'm not talking about assisted suicide or anything like that. That's clearly wrong. But I'm talking about those that just basically mentally say I'm done. What is the church's stance? Because the example you gave was Saint Maximum Kolbe in the Holocaust saw people who accepted that, and then they would pass away much faster than those who wanted to keep fighting, if you will. And there's all kinds of different stories across history about that. Does the church have any answer on that? Did those that just say, "I'm ready, it's okay, I want to go home," or it, are we called to essentially constantly fight nonstop, tooth and nail?
Um, that's probably a little longer answer. It's worth
Fair enough.
exploring in more detail than a yes or no, and we're coming up to the end of our time here, so.
We are so fair enough. I apologize. This is 2 weeks in a row I've done that to your father. Well, with that being said, we will do that for next week. We will go from there, and we hope that everyone out there had a great episode. You like it? Please click like and subscribe and share and all that fun stuff. And we'll be with you here next week.